How you doing, brothers and sisters? It's been a long time, but I want to make a study, and I got to get right into it because this won't record very long. We're going to do a study of covenants by Webster. It's one of the Bible studies I do through the mail. I'm in a bunch of them. I have a bunch of certificates and diplomas. I've graduated a lot of Bible study correspondence schools now. I'm not saying I believe everything this guy teaches, but this is a very good teaching on the two covenants and the transfer between the old and the new. What would you say is the most misunderstood page in the Bible? The first page, which includes Genesis 1, the 70 weeks of Daniel 9, the valley of dry bones. Okay. The most misunderstood page in the Bible is the one between the Testaments, the Old Law and the New Law. To be correctly understood, the Bible must be rightly divided, as it says in 2 Timothy 2:15. Today, the majority of the religious world tries to live under at least part of the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. This is not a new problem. 3 books of the New Testament, Romans, Galatians, and Hebrews, were written to people who were trying to either live under the Old Law or to augment the New Testament with the Old Testament practices in the first century. We live under only the New Testament of Christ today. Hebrews 1:1-2, Galatians 3:19-25. As the Old Testament is no longer in force, Colossians 2:14, Ephesians 2:15, Romans 7:6-7, Hebrews 8:6-7. Study all these references I'm giving you, and it'll bring all this together. First, we know we are under the New Testament because the Old Testament predicted its own demise. Early in the Mosaic period, God hinted that change would eventually come. He told Moses that he would raise up another prophet like unto him, Deuteronomy 18:15 and 18. Each succeeding generation in Israel was on the lookout for that prophet. John 1:21-25 and chapter 6, verse 14. Later, that prophet was clearly identified as Christ. Acts chapter 3, verses 22-23, and chapter 7, verse 37. What did God mean by a prophet like unto Moses? Dozens of prophets came after Moses. Many were great men in their own right. David, Isaiah, Daniel, Elijah, Elisha, Ezekiel. But none was like unto Moses. Moses was the deliverer of God's people from bondage. Moses was God's lawgiver. No other Old Testament seer could lay claim to these. The New Testament begins by announcing the birth of the one who would come. Christ was a deliverer. He was God's new lawgiver. On the Mount of Transfiguration, Peter wanted to build 3 tabernacles, one for Moses, one for Elijah, and one for Christ. God insisted, "This is my beloved Son. Hear ye him." Matthew chapter 17, verse 5. There had been a time to hear Moses, the old law, and Elijah, the prophets. But the time had come to hear the new lawgiver and prophet, Jesus Christ. Hebrews chapter 1, verse 1-2. Later in Old Testament history, God made it clearer still that his intentions were to replace the law of Moses. He revealed to Jeremiah, the prophet, that there would come a day when he would make a new covenant, a new law, with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 31-34. Since Jeremiah lived under the law of Moses, Moses' law could not have been the new covenant. Further, the new law would differ from the old law that God made with their fathers when they came out of Egypt, Exodus 20. The old law was engraved in stones, 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 7. The new law would be engraved in the hearts of men. Under the Old Testament, adherents were born into the family and then taught to know God, Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4-9. Under the New Testament, men are taught and then born into God's family, John chapter 3, verses 3-5. Under the old, there was a remembrance of sins every year, Hebrews chapter 10, verses 1-4. Under the new law, there is no remembrance of forgiven sin, Matthew chapter 26, verse 28, and Hebrews chapter 8, verse 12. Second, we know we are under the New Testament because the early history of the church makes it clear that a change had taken place. The law of Moses contained strict dietary restrictions. Leviticus chapter 11, verses 46 through 47. In a vision, God told Peter to eat animals that were unclean under the law of Moses. Acts chapter 11, verse 5 through 10, as a way to show Peter that Gentiles could be saved. Since God tempts no man to sin, James chapter 1, verse 13, if the law of Moses were still in effect, God would not have told Peter to eat these animals, because that would be tempting him to sin under the old law. But since no meats are to be refused under the New Testament, 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 4, God could require this and not tempt Peter to sin. The Jews that heard the apostles preach understood that they were speaking of a change from the law of Moses. Acts chapter 6, 13 through 14, when Paul was in Corinth and Gallio was the deputy of Achaia, the Jews made insurrection with one accord against Paul, and brought him to the judgment seat, saying, This fellow persuadeth men to worship God, contrary to the old law that they thought they were still under. Acts chapter 18, 12 through 13. The Jews in Jerusalem were convinced that Paul taught all the Jews which are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children, neither to walk after the customs. Acts chapter 21, verse 21. They correctly perceived that the apostles were teaching against the law. Acts 21, verse 28. The Jews thought that Paul and the other apostles were wrong, but they clearly understood that the apostles were teaching that the Old Testament had been replaced by the New Testament. That's what Paul was preaching. Third, we know we are under the New Testament because the epistles explain the old law has been replaced by the New Testament. In 2 Corinthians, Paul proclaimed that the old law was done away with in Christ. 2 Corinthians 3, 7 through 11. The ministration of death, written and engraven in stones, talking about the Ten Commandments, the old law, was glorious. 2 Corinthians 3, 7. But the ministration of the Spirit, which comes through Christ, the new law, the gospel, was more glorious. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, 8 through 9. Romans chapter 1, 16 through 17. As Christians, we have been liberated from the old law. Galatians 5, verse 13. In Ephesians, Paul revealed that Christ hath made both one and hath broken down the middle wall of partition between us. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 14. This refers to the unity between Jews and Gentiles that resulted from Christ removing the law of Moses that was keeping them separated. Jesus did away with this middle wall of partition, Moses' law, when he died. Ephesians chapter 2, 13 through 15. All can now be united in the church, the body of Christ. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 4, chapter 1, 22 through 23. When they obey the gospel, 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, 8, 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 17. How blessed we are to be delivered from the law of Moses, with all its difficult commands and ceremonies. Christ abolished in his flesh the enmity, even the law of commandments contained in ordinances. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 15, Hebrews chapter 7, verse 18. Abolished means to cause to cease, to put to death, put an end to, do away with, annul. Ordinances are numbered laws, as in the Ten Commandments. So the law of commandments contained in ordinances refers to the old law. Exodus 24, verse 12. Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 10. And 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 3. And Amos chapter 2, verse 4. Thus the old law was caused to cease in the death of Christ. The Jewish system was thus included in Jesus' statement from the cross. It is finished. John 19, verse 30. In Colossians, Paul said the old law had been done away with in the death of Christ. Colossians 2, verse 14. He spoke of Christ as blotting out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, which was contrary to us. The Greek term for handwriting of ordinances, chiriographon, refers to a handwritten document, specifically a certificate of indebtedness, as in we are indebted to somebody. Blotting out means to obliterate, wipe out, blot out. The same word is used in Revelation chapter 3, verse 5. This passage may hint of an ancient practice of canceling a debt by crossing out a transaction with X, the Greek letter chi, or chi. The handwriting of ordinances refers to the Old Testament law, which was written by the finger of God. Exodus 31, verse 18, 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 34 and 37, Luke chapter 1, verse 6, Ephesians chapter 2, verse 15, and Hebrews chapter 9, verse 1 and 10. The old law was against us and contrary to us because it could only condemn us once we sinned. Hebrews chapter 8 and 10. Or Hebrews chapter 8 through 10. Christ took it out of the way by nailing it to his cross. Galatians chapter 2 verse 14 and Hebrews chapter 10 verse 9. Since the old law was fastened to the cross with Christ, it was not intended to be observed following his death and resurrection. In Hebrews, the writer used the illustration of the priesthood to show the law had changed. The Old Testament priests under Moses' law came from the tribe of Levi. Hebrews chapter 7 verse 11. But Christ came from the tribe of Judah. Hebrews chapter 7, 13 through 14. Christ was a priest after the order of Melchizedek, not after the order of Aaron, where Moses' law came from. Hebrews chapter 7, 15 through 17. Thus, Jesus could not be a priest if the law of Moses were still binding. The point is that there had to be a change in the law in order for Christ to be the high priest. Hebrews chapter 7, verse 12. Those who hold on to the old law must necessarily reject Christ as high priest. Many today make the same mistake that some early Jewish Christians made. They try to observe part of the Old Testament and part of the New Testament. They pick some things that appeal to them from the Old Testament and merge them with the teachings of the New Testament. Some like Sabbath Saturday worship. Some want to bring over incense, tithing, or instrumental music. Psalms 150. Others like its less strict rules on divorce or remarriage. Deuteronomy 24 and Matthew 19, verse 9. God does not allow us to mix the laws. In fact, the consequences of trying to live under the old law today are serious. One who takes one thing from the old law is responsible for continuing in all things that are written in the book of the law to do them. Galatians 3, verse 10, and James 2, 10 through 11. That is, if we take part of it, we have to take all of it, including animal sacrifices, feast days, annual trips to Jerusalem, and stoning disobedient children. Even if one today could keep the entire old law, which is an impossibility, he would still be lost because he rejected Christ's law in order to embrace the old law. Hebrews 10, 26 through 29, John 12, verse 48. To keep the Old Testament law today is taunt to amount to falling from grace. Galatians 5, verse 4. Most religious people and many unreligious people hold firmly to keeping the Ten Commandments. They are surprised to learn that the Ten Commandments as such are no longer required. But before we assume that this means we can worship idols, disobey our parents, commit adultery, steal, lie, we hasten to add that the New Testament still